Hey everyone, I want you to open your books to page 598. We're going to be going over a few pages in this video today, and I just want you to have a pencil or a highlighter or something in your hand so you can annotate the parts that I emphasize. Okay, so this chapter 30, Post-Cold War World, 1990 to present. Okay, the first paragraph, I would underline that entire first paragraph. Just kind of read it to you here. President Ronald Reagan's appeal to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, hopefully you remember those names, came 2 years before the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Remember when he said, "Tear down this wall." 2 years after the fall, a coup ousted Gorbachev from power. The Soviet Union had officially collapsed. The Cold War was over. Communist governments remained in only a few countries, including China, North Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam. That is still the case today, by the way. For some 45 years, the rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union had dominated the world stage. For much of that time, the threat of nuclear war loomed large, and that's not really something you hear about too much anymore. Okay? It's not really a fear that most people have, since the nuclear threat is not nearly as big as it was during the Cold War. Okay, so you have a lot of new openness to society, as you see starting right here. With this new openness, particularly with regard to trade, the world became more interconnected than ever before. We call that globalization, which produced greater wealth for many, but hardships for others. Okay, so the first section here, economic globalization. The big thing to underline here is this sentence: global trade exploded with the end of the Cold War. It absolutely did. The economy boomed throughout the world because the Soviet Union broke up. All those nations were now free to trade with the West, and so did Eastern Europe. Okay, next paragraph here. Okay, a new global economy was part of a renewed emphasis on market-oriented policy. Okay, another term for this is supply-side economics, or Reaganomics, like we have learned about before. Okay, this policy was advocated by leaders such as Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain. Both people you need to know, both names you should circle here. They advocated cutting taxes, regulations, and government assistance to the poor as a way to promote economic growth. Okay, so this did work well. Remember, as I said, in around 1983, when this economic boom began, it continued for about 25 years up until 2008. So very effective policy here. Now we get to Japan. Okay, the rise of Japan took place in the 1990s, mostly, as you see at the bottom of this paragraph. It says large investments from the United States and other countries went into Japan, and this turned Japan into a manufacturing powerhouse, creating jobs and wealth. Okay, we really made Japan into a great nation. Okay, and still, have no hard feelings about World War II, because we are close allies now because they changed so much, and we helped them to do that. All right, this next section called the Tigers and China. The Asian Tigers, okay, this phrase right here, the Asian Tigers, underline these four nations, okay? Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. All right, those are called the Asian Tigers. All right. Now the success, as you see at the bottom of the paragraph here, the success of the Asian Tigers in China raised hundreds of millions of people out of dire poverty. Okay, right in the margin there. That is what capitalism does. Okay, since those Asian Tigers, places like Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, embraced democracy, embraced capitalism, millions and millions and millions of people were lifted out of poverty. And also because China implemented capitalism, okay, they did away with their socialist economic system, they were also able to raise people out of poverty. All right, India, Brazil, and Russia. Okay, with its highly educated English-speaking workforce, India developed a software and information technology powerhouse. All right, so that is a big thing India is known for today. If you've ever called tech support for some kind of computer or phone or anything that you have, a lot of times you'll get connected to someone in India, all right, because that is the huge economic market in India today. All right, drawing investments from American and European countries who look to outsource jobs and take advantage of lower labor costs. This is what a lot of American companies do. They outsource jobs to poorer countries like India because people will work for less. All right, next page. In spite of India's growing middle class, hundreds of millions of Indians remained in poverty. That is still the case today. India is still a third world nation, even though they are the second largest nation in the world population-wise. In a few years, they will probably surpass China in population. And in spite of their growing middle class, still hundreds of millions of Indians live in poverty. This is because of two things. Write this in the margin. Because of the caste system, which keeps people in whatever social caste they are in, all right, and also because of government corruption. All right, those two things keep India impoverished. Next paragraph, talking about Brazil. Okay, it's agribusinesses, agriculture, and steel industries brought considerable wealth to the nation. So that's the big thing to know about Brazil. They have a big agriculture business and steel industry. And then the last paragraph in that section about Russia. Russia's oil wealth markedly expanded its economy after the end of the Cold War. There's a lot of oil in Russia. Since they were able to now trade that oil with other nations, sell it to other nations, their economy really boomed. Okay, this new class of people called oligarchs is what people called them, that just became fabulously wealthy throughout the 1990s. Once Russians were granted freedom, they really came about at that time. Trade and economic development. Okay, last sentence in that first paragraph there. By the 1990s, average tariff rates had sunk below 5%, easing the movement of goods across national borders. Okay, so because tariffs went down, okay, you had a lot more trade between countries throughout the 1990s. Okay, I want you guys to go to the next page there, globalization and technology. Okay, globalization made the world feel smaller, as did advances in telecommunications technology. The internet, circle that. Okay, what you are watching this on, your lifeline during this quarantine here, the internet, first developed for the U.S. Department of Defense during the Cold War. Okay, it was around 1990 that the internet was first invented, and it was at first used just by the American military. But it became a regular tool of communication for the public by the late 1990s. By 1999, basically, almost every household either had internet in their house or at least had access to internet, like at a local library or something like that. I remember my family specifically, we got the internet in the year 2000. I still remember people in the 90s coming over and saying, hey, do you guys have the internet yet? And we're like, oh, no, not this year. We might afford it next year. But it's just kind of crazy to think about that. Like, do you have the internet yet? Okay, because it was just this new thing, this new word. And of course, nowadays, it's one of the biggest things in the entire world. Not only had communication become easier, but information was also more abundant and accessible than ever before. Really a great thing. Upheaval in Muslim countries, a less great thing. December 2010 marked the beginning of a series of popular uprisings in many Arab countries known as the Arab Spring. Circle that term, the Arab Spring. We will talk about this in a couple classes, so just keep that in mind here. Bottom of that paragraph says, in Egypt, protests organized through social media soon erupted in Cairo and other cities against the regime of authoritarian President Hosni Mubarak. Okay, he became president in Egypt in the early 1980s after Anwar Sadat was assassinated. After a month of protests, Mubarak stepped down, handing power to his vice president. He actually just died a couple months ago. So keep that in mind. We will be talking about that in a couple of class periods. Global popular culture. Okay, pop culture, something you're all very involved with. Okay, the emergence of global brands really began in the 1990s. Circle that term in the third sentence there. Global brands, things like Apple, Nike, Rolex, you might not be as familiar with, but that's a type of watch. Okay, these global brands really emerged once the global economy opened up after the Cold War. Okay, after 2000, the cultural marketplace diversified, and you have all sorts of new entertainment being streamed throughout the world. Really throughout the world, they watch Hollywood movies. They watch American television. I remember when I lived in England, I asked them, is it weird to hear my American accent? Because to me, it was really strange to hear their British accents. It was cool. It was just different. And they said, no, it's not really different at all because we hear your kind of accents all the time on TV. So that's an example of global popular culture. Next paragraph talks about something I just mentioned. However, the United States remained the world's most influential culture, indeed it still is today, through Americanization, circle that term. People the world over learned more about the United States. Okay, so this is an example of American being the only superpower in the world, which we still are today. English became a second language in much of the world. They call English the language of business. The dominance of the United States in globalization. Okay, you have a lot of power concentrated in the U.S. during this time, and of course, Americanization followed. Sports. Okay, one of my favorite topics. Okay, one of the things that is one of the biggest bummers for me during this quarantine is I can't watch my St. Louis Cardinals. But sports became huge throughout the world during this time as well. You have the modern Olympic Games becoming bigger and bigger. The World Cup is a huge deal. Any soccer fans in here? Basketball became a global game. All right, and this really changed the face of the world. Religion also, okay, you have the introduction of New Age religions, okay, forms of Buddhism, shamanism, Sufism, and other religious traditions. They were revived and adapted for a largely Western audience, okay, so these kind of Eastern mystic religions, mysticism, and New Age religions became more popular during this time too. And then we get to struggles for democracy, okay, democracy seems to come naturally in some places. In other places, it's a real struggle and doesn't come as easily. In the United States, African Americans won major victories against discrimination and segregation, as we know about the Civil Rights Movement. You've learned about it a lot, I'm sure, and I know you'll learn about it a lot next year in U.S. history as well. Another civil rights movement that occurred in the world was the movement against apartheid in South Africa. This is something you're probably less familiar with, so be sure to read these couple of paragraphs carefully a couple times over. First off, South America's system of apartheid, circle that term right there. It was instituted in 1948, and it tried to separate whites and blacks as much as possible. Okay, so you might think similar to segregation, but one way this was different is that in America, whites were and are the majority, whereas blacks the minority. In South Africa, it was the exact opposite. White South Africans made up only 15% of South Africa's population, but still all the good jobs, all the privileges were reserved to them because of the system of apartheid. Okay, I think the last sentence here sums it up really well. These dehumanizing decrees marginalized the 85% of South Africans who were black, South Asian, or mixed race. Okay, so you had challenges to apartheid growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and eventually it led to the abolition of apartheid. Okay, one name you need to know, Nelson Mandela. Circle his name. There is a quote by Nelson Mandela on the big window in our library at school. Okay, so whenever we go back, make sure to take a look at that and see that quote by Nelson Mandela. He was a leader of the ANC. Circle that right there, the African National Congress. Now, he was imprisoned for life for agitating against apartheid. Okay, one thing that the book does not mention, okay, largely because Mandela is seen overall as a really good person, which in a lot of ways he was imprisoned for agitating against apartheid violently. Okay, he was not a peaceful protester at first. He was a violent protester. Okay. But while he was in prison, he changed his mind and became an advocate of peaceful resistance. Okay, Mandela's imprisonment throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s inspired a global movement to end apartheid. Since a lot of people identified with Mandela, especially after he changed his mind and was no longer an advocate of violence, they wanted him to be released from prison, and they wanted apartheid to end. Okay, in 1989, you see right here, F.W. de Klerk, he became the nation's acting president, and he recognized the need for change. So he saw himself as something that's going to bridge the gap between apartheid South Africa and free South Africa. Okay, and that's exactly what he did. Within 6 months, he announced Mandela's release from prison. A series of reforms in the 1990s ended apartheid, thankfully. And in 1994, South Africa held its first free elections, meaning elections where all people could vote regardless of the color of their skin. And then, big day right here, on May 10th, 1994, Nelson Mandela was sworn in as president, South Africa's first black leader. Okay, since now 85% of the country all of a sudden had voting rights, naturally the majority wanted someone like Mandela as their president, so Mandela became the president of South Africa, their first black leader. Turn the page. Now we get to China. Okay, something you hear about in the news all the time. Okay, but let's focus on what they were doing in the 80s and 90s. After the economic reforms of the late 80s and 1990s, China quickly became an economic powerhouse. The economic liberalization, however, was not matched by democratic reforms. Like I said, there are two facets to communism: economic communism and social communism, the two types of oppression. So China made their country economically free, but not socially free. Okay, they did not have democratic reforms, and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, still ruled the People's Republic with an iron fist. Okay, and this is still the case today, y'all. Okay, the Chinese Communist Party is still one of the most oppressive groups in the entire world. In fact, connecting to something that's going on right now, when they had their first case of coronavirus back in November, they silenced the whistleblower who was going to tell the world about this new virus that we need to do something about. He disappeared, which means he was probably murdered. They stopped testing, they lied about it, and tried to cover up the growing pandemic in their own country. Now, if they had not done that, if they had acted sooner, the University of Southampton just did a study that said 95% of all coronavirus cases could have been prevented. Okay, we wouldn't be in this situation if it weren't for the Chinese Communist Party. All right, so keep that in mind when you learn about them, when you learn about communism. Okay, the death toll still mounts from communist regimes. And one death toll that happened in 1989, we already talked about it. Just real quick here, you have the Tiananmen Square riots. Okay, so just read through this on your own here. I know we've already talked about it. Just let me know if you have any questions further about it. Minority rights in China. China has one of the worst human rights abuse records of any country in all of world history. You have religious persecution of both Muslims and Christians. Still today in China, there are an estimated 1 million Uyghurs, which are Chinese Muslims, imprisoned in prison camps, okay, kind of like concentration camps in China's Guangdong province in the west. Okay, so really bad human rights abuses, not something that we should take lightly. You also have environmental degradation in China. All Chinese cities experienced air pollution resulting from the increased use of coal to run power plants and factories and the increased number of motor vehicles in the streets and roads. Okay, water pollution, another serious problem. They have very unclean air and water there. In fact, most pollution in the world comes from China and India. Okay, so definitely keep that in mind as well. Okay, yes, it is important for the United States to have environmental regulations, but also keep in mind, okay, that doesn't do all that much unless China and India go along with that, since they are by far the largest polluters. All right, and then we get to global security, our last section for today, global security. In the early 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, President George H.W. Bush, one name to underline, declared a new world order. Circle that term. That was the phrase he used. He said, now that the Soviet Union is gone, we need a new world order, one in which the U.S. would take the lead in creating a unified and secure world. And really throughout the 1990s and 2000s, those were the American decades. Okay, that was when America was on top of the world. Some might say we squandered it in certain ways. Others might say we took advantage of it in a good way. Completely your opinion on that. Okay, but the New World Order was about trying to make a unified and secure world with the U.S. taking the lead there. Bush also used the term in describing the coalition of nations that joined in a war against Iraq in 1991 after Saddam Hussein's forces invaded Kuwait. This Persian Gulf War, circle that, okay, remember what we talked about there, resulted in Hussein's forces being driven out of Kuwait. However, the coalition, fearing that deposing Hussein would destabilize the Middle East, did not drive him from power. I just want to ask you, do you think that was a good thing? Should we have invaded Iraq afterwards, or did we do the right thing by removing our troops from Kuwait once Hussein was out of Kuwait? Completely your opinion, but good to think about. At the top of the next page there, it talks about the lack of enmity between Russia and the West in the early 1990s. This was largely because of the first leader of the new Russian Republic after the fall of the Soviet Union. Write his name in the margin. His name was Boris Yeltsin. BorisYeltsin. Boris Yeltsin was a very pro-Western, pro-American leader of Russia. Really an excellent leader. He was the leader from 1991 until 1999, when unfortunately Vladimir Putin, who's certainly not like that, became the ruler of Russia, who he still is today. Okay, the growth of terrorism is where we're going to pick up next class when we talk about 9/11 and the war on terror. All right, so just hang tight until then, and let me know in the general discussion board on Canvas if you have any questions about what we just went over.